Alright there, Chatter Chapkins. Look, pal, I get it. I made a mistake, okay? I made a video about Sniper. That was a misplay. And in that video, I said that Sniper was the worst class, as you can see right here through the thumbnail. But when I made that video, I didn't know Sniper was such a hot-button topic, and when I said he was the worst class, I didn't mean that he was the weakest, I meant that I thought he was the worst design. But it turns out, not even that was true, because there's a class far worse, far more poorly designed, far more useless, far more situational, far more annoying, and from a far worse country. France! And of course, you know who I'm talking about. Yes, the Spy. You know him. You might not like him, and he might owe you $30, but one thing is for sure. The Spy is Team Fortress 2's worst class. Pretty much everybody agrees upon this statement, and if they don't, well, we don't really need to talk about what happens to them. Spy has a multitude of problems. Pretty much everything about him is flawed in one way or another, and he doesn't really have that many strengths that he can utilize to his advantage. And even when he does, his strengths aren't really that strong compared to other classes. But what if I told you that Spy wasn't about being good? That Spy wasn't even about playing Team Fortress 2? That the Spy community was after something more sinister than that? But of course, we'll have to get to that later. What's wrong with Spy? Well, for one thing, he's a bit of a womanizer, he's a deadbeat dad, and he's rude to everybody because he thinks he's better than them. And also, everything about his entire character design is kind of bad. Spy's game plan is to either use cloaking or disguises to obfuscate his position or his identity to be able to get behind enemy teams, walk up to their important classes, and backstab them, killing them instantly. He is the hardest definition of a pick class in the world, which is ironic because you really shouldn't pick Spy. But the thing about Spy is that doing any of this is a lot easier said than done. For one thing, his entire game plan of getting close to people is a bit dangerous. Spy has no health and no mobility, and dealing with many of his mechanics is a lot easier than making them actually work. Firstly, Spy has a problem with agency, which is really funny because typically spies work at agencies like the CIA or Burger King. What I mean by agency is that Spy has a problem with turning his situations that aren't necessarily good for him into ones that are. For example, if a soldier runs up against an enemy team that has a lot of pyros, that's not necessarily a very great situation to be in. Pyros obviously have a good matchup versus soldiers, but the soldier has things he can proactively do to turn that situation around into something that's more positive for him. For one thing, you can make a pyro whiff an air blast and then shoot them with a rocket, or you can just equip a shotgun. If you're playing Engineer and you're having problems with spies, you can start regularly checking all of your allies. You can also equip something like the Southern Hospitality to make it easier to find them. But when faced with situations that aren't necessarily preferable for him, Spy can't really do as much. For one thing, again, his game plan just isn't really that strong. And also, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with it that aren't necessarily his fault. There's a lot of things he can't control that need to go correctly for him to actually be able to do what makes him strong. If there's a lot of enemy pyros, if the enemy team is just very observant, if there's overlapping sentry guns, if the enemy team just happens to be spy checking a lot, if somebody doesn't happen to be turned around when you need them to, or the server's laggy, if there aren't any good flanks, these are difficult problems that the Spy doesn't necessarily have great tools to solve. And these are a sample of things that the Spy needs to have go right to be able to do anything effective, versus other characters who need enemies to exist for them to be able to effectively kill them. Spy can still be effective, of course, he just has to go through more steps to do so than other classes. And many of these steps are difficult for him to really have control over. This is what often leads to competitive spies kind of just sitting around a lot, relaying information to their team. And in fairness, that is what a spy does. Other classes get more value out of their mechanics than Spy does. And also, there's lots of little micro situations that Spy literally just can't control no matter how hard you try. If you're running up to somebody through the enemy team and you're about to get a backstab on them, and they just turn around at the last second right as you swing, there's not really much you could have done to have stopped that. Or if you happen to disguise as somebody and your disguise just breaks because they're broken and buggy, there's not too much you can do about that either. Or hell, you could be in prime position to get a backstab and just not get it because netcode. You can't really control how astute or observant your enemies are, you can't really control where people are facing, and you can't really control the fact that random spy checking is just really efficient. This is unlike other classes who have much less to worry about when it comes to the behavior of their enemies. Soldier doesn't really care where you're facing, how much you know about him, or oftentimes what you're even doing. He's just gonna shoot rockets at you. Same goes for many other characters in the game. In fact, most classes in the game have a better risk-reward balance than Spy does, which is another one of his major problems. Getting a good reward out of backstabs and disguises is a lot harder than pretty much any other weapon for any other class. Sure, you can get a big chain stab and kill a lot of people on the enemy team, and that's awesome, but if you want to kill a lot of people on the enemy team, you can also shoot sticky bombs, and those are pretty good at it. The reward for playing Spy well is a backstab, and a backstab is a very good reward. It's a no questions asked one-shot, something that all D&D players strive for. But getting that one-shot, again, is just riskier than it is for other classes. Snipers, again, can also one-shot people, but from a distance, where they're very safe, and classes like the Soldier, or the Demo Man, or the Heavy, can kill many opponents in sequence without really needing to one-shot them. This is versus the Spy, who has to go through an elaborate series of disguises and cloaks to get into the right position, not get found, or only get found by people who can't stop him. And then he can get a backstab, which causes a very loud noise and leaves him in the center of the enemy team, surrounded by people who can kill him. And obviously this was by design. This was Gabe Newell's greatest sick joke, his most dastardly scheme that he played on the poor addicts of Team Fortress 2. But when it comes to Spy's problems with risk and reward, it's often not necessarily the risk that is the problematic part. A lot of times, it's the reward. What does a disguise actually do? For example, the revolver can deal anywhere from like 60 to 20 damage at a half-decent fire rate. The sapper can deactivate and destroy an enemy engineer's buildings. Cloaking makes you invisible and makes it so enemy players can't see you unless they happen to bump into you. The backstab kills an enemy player. These all have inherent tangible reward, but a disguise's rewards are entirely dependent on the opposing person just believing you. And sure, you can move and position in certain ways that make you more believable. You obviously don't want to just disguise as an allied heavy and walk in from your side of the map, since that looks really suspicious. I mean, just roleplay with me for a second. No, not that kind of roleplay. Imagine you're a soldier on the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, Dust Bowl, and you see an allied soldier walking in from the enemy fog of war. Alone, without any help, not firing their gun. That looks really weird. It's not very hard to spy check this person. I mean, what happens if you're wrong when you spy check somebody? Nothing. You might lose like 2 shotgun shells. And if you're right, you kill a whole spy. And this is an inherent problem with disguises at all, is that even if you're positioning and moving correctly, and you're putting up a good illusion of being an enemy teammate, they don't have to believe you. The cost of checking for a spy is so dramatically low compared to the reward that there's not really a reason not to just do it sometimes. And this is why good spy players will typically try to take as much advantage of a cloak instead as they can. Cloak actually does something. It's much more difficult for somebody to find you when you're cloaked than when you're disguised, as I said before. But even then, being disguised is a crucial part of the spy ecosystem. You can't stab while you're cloaked, so at some point you've got to decloak. And when you do, it's best to have a disguise just so that maybe somebody who happens to see you out of the corner of their eye won't immediately recognize that you're a spy, and also you can get over sentry guns. So having this crucial piece of what is effectively security for the spy be so easily foiled is really tough to live with. And outside of the whole backstab formula, his other options are not particularly strong. Sappers are really not the best way to deal with buildings, even though they do disable them, which can be very nice, and the revolvers are all obviously relatively weak compared to other primaries. The Ambassador, the Diamondback, and the Stock are sufficient, I would say, but also Spy doesn't have a lot of alternative weapons in any of his slots that really do much to help out his game plan. The best things he has are the Diamondback and the Kunai, and I would also argue the Cloak and Dagger, weapons that allow him to stay cloaked more often and reward him better for his backstabs. If you're gonna go the distance of walking towards the enemy team and trying to backstab a random enemy, at the very least having knives that make it so that you can then get out of that situation without getting immediately blown up are quite nice and very useful. And the Diamondback is the Diamondback, it's a fucking ridiculous weapon. But outside of these few exceptions, his weapons are mostly not that good or very interesting. Spy has basically no alternative game plans outside of the whole backstabbing thing. So if that's not working out, you're pretty much bummed. It's like college. If you don't have enough money to pass all of your classes, then the job market is going to have nothing for you but working at a fast food restaurant and robbing liquor stores. And on top of all of this, for some inexplicable reason, Valve, reaching into their absolutely depthless pit of madness, decided to add a bunch of anti-spy weapons to the game so that people who could already very easily deal with the worst class in the game can now more easily deal with the worst class in the game. They added the Razorback, the Homewrecker, the Hulong Heater, the Thompson, all weapons that very directly and specifically mention the spy or one of his mechanics mechanics as something that they're better at dealing with. And the best part is that many of them aren't even good at it. The Razorback really just makes it so the spy has to use his revolver every once in a while, and the Hulong Heater is basically useless at actually stopping spies. And it's not even like they try to do it in an interesting way. One of them just tries to punish Spy for using his most important mechanic, and the other one just prevents him from doing so. Because again, Spy is a terrible idea, and the only way that Valve could have thought to make Spy worse at what he wants to do is to just not make him be able to do it. Because much like a bearing bomb in a wheelchair, Spy hedges his entire payload on one thing. And Valve thought that the way to deal with this problem was to attack the bomb. It turns out it's to attack the wheelchair. Because while a lot of the very direct anti-spy tools aren't very good at dealing with Spy, a lot of everything else is. Anything that adds bleed, a wet state, or fire makes it easier to detect the Spy on top of their normal effects. And Spy doesn't really have anything to return in kind with, like he has the Spicicle, which is good against his Pyro matchup, and that's about it. Now, you might be thinking, holy crap, this guy just spent like an hour talking about how bad Spy is. After hearing all of this bad news, I should take all of my money out of Northrop Grumman immediately. But don't worry, the war in Yemen shows no signs of stopping, and Spy hasn't been associated with Northrop Grumman in 10 years, so your stock prices will not go down. And also, Spy isn't unfixable, to a degree. The problem with Spy is Spy players. You could fix Spy very easily. You could make the character healthier for the game, better, more consistent, you could do all of this. But why do you think it hasn't happened yet? And you might say, well, it's because Valve is a giant lazy colossus that has absolutely no reason to move or do anything important, because they have an unlimited printer of money caused by a monopolization of the PC games distribution market, and because of the fact that nobody in their business actually has any reason to do anything, and in fact has reasons to not do things outside of vanity projects that make them look good in the public eye. But that's not the reason, because the reason people play Spy is far more sinister than that. Why do people play Spy? Why do people go to Las Vegas? Why do they put hundreds or thousands of dollars into machines with completely rigged odds that they're aware of? Why do people buy lottery tickets? Why do YouTubers try to fetch cigarettes out of a dumpster? It's because of gambling. It's because of that incredibly tiny chance that maybe you really will get away with it. And that's why people play Spy. Every round of Spy is gambling. There are so few consistencies, so many risks, and such a fantastic, satisfying reward that you couldn't compare it to anything else. You thought Team Fortress 2 had gambling because of crates? No, crates are merely a front. The real scam is Spy. But you know what I think? I think fuck Spy players. We're gonna fix this character whether they like it or not. And of course by fix, I mean talk about things I would do if I had the ability to do so, and then not actually do anything, because I am a YouTuber, the most valuable and important kind of person on the planet. So, how do you fix Spy? Especially in such a way that doesn't damage his identity, or change him into something that people aren't here for. Because the thing about fixing a character is that there's always a way to fix a character if you're willing to drastically change them, but if you're going to do that, you risk alienating the reason people are playing them at all. And that makes it much harder to actually fix a character, because you have to maintain their identity. That being said, I think there's still things Valve could do if they ever decide to unlock the TF2 office doors to immediately make Spy better. First off, I think a lot of Spy's weapons could be redesigned into something much more interesting than they are. I think changing stuff like the Enforcer, the L'étranger, or however you speak it, it's fucking French, who cares, into something that's either more useful in certain matchups, or just overall stronger than it is, would be a great direction to go in for Spy. The places where Spy needs it the most, though, is probably in his PDAs and his sappers. Obviously, there's no PDA alternatives, which I think is a huge waste of potential. And the only sapper alternative is the red tape recorder, and the red tape recorder is a piece of shit. And I think there's tons that you could do with either of these slots that they just never took advantage of. Additionally, I think certain anti-spy weapons should just not be anti-spy weapons. Like, I don't know why the Homewrecker needs to be able to get rid of sappers. It seems excessive on the character that's already incredibly good against spy. But stuff like the Hulong Heater is neither effective as an anti-spy deterrent or as a minigun, so I think weapons like that should just be changed to be more generally useful or useful in different situations, instead of trying and failing to be a spy matchup tool. The thing about spy is that you don't even need matchup tools against spy, you just need to turn around. So the fact that there's so many different anti-spy matchup weapons is ridiculous, especially considering spy doesn't get that same kind of treatment in reverse, which is something that I think they could change. Additionally, I think spy could use with just a teeny tiny, itty bitty little movement speed buff. Not too much. I'm not saying he should be scout,
I'm saying he should be faster.
No, but I mean like a tiny amount, like maybe 5% more. That way Spy could actually catch other spies, medics, and just be able to more consistently get up to people when he's trailing them, outside of like just heavies. Now, if you wanted to be a little bit more experimental with it, I think there's a lot of stuff you could do with Spy that doesn't necessarily harm his identity, while still making him a lot better. One thing I would like to see is a change to the PDA, one that gives the Spy different effects or abilities based on whom he's disguised as. For example, if you're disguised as a scout, maybe you get a little bit of a movement speed buff. If you're disguised as the heavy, maybe you get more health while you're disguised, or a damage resistance. If you're disguised as the pyro, maybe you're immune to afterburn. Things that not only balance out the differences between the different disguises, because scout and heavy as a disguise are kind of just pointless, but also give the disguises inherent tangible value, so that Spy isn't just hoping that people believe him when he uses them. Of course, when it comes to experimental or extreme changes, you have to be careful. The thing about Team Fortress 2 is that it has a bit of an identity crisis. There's games where you could have just one spy on a team, and then any experimental changes aren't necessarily that bad because they're just on the one spy. But then you also have games where you have like 4 spies, and then any big extreme changes you've made are now affecting the game multiplicatively. And this is honestly one of the things that I think harms the balance of Team Fortress 2 the most. If you have a controlled number of classes, then you don't need to worry about having too many. But since classes can be anywhere from completely absent to dominating the majority of the team, you have to balance very, very carefully. But again, outside of these two things, I don't think there's too much you can do without, once again, harming the Spy's identity. The problem with Spy is that he has a one-shot. That's entirely what the character was built around. And one-shots are inherently kind of annoying if there isn't a precedent set for them. In something like Counter-Strike, a lot of weapons can one-shot you, and a lot of other weapons can 2- or 3-shot you. So one-shots aren't really that big of a deal as far as being a pain point is concerned. But in games like Team Fortress 2, where the TTK is relatively high, being able to one-shot is kind of a big deal. This is why the Spy has to go through so many hoops to get his, because the concept of this reward is kind of just inherently flawed. Spy, overall, does a good job of making this one-shot fun to get and pretty fair to play against. But one thing that I think might be cool, even though it's more on the experimental end and probably doesn't work when you have like 3 spies on the team, is the idea of giving the Spy like anti-buildings. What I mean by that is basically allowing the Spy to have like deployable sappers that he can use to sort of harass the enemy team by giving them negative effects. Maybe like he can deploy this sapper, place it somewhere in the world, and then while it's deployed, it slows down enemies or reduces healing received or something like that. This would obviously have to be something that's on a timer, and it would probably require the Spy to have to go get some ammo to recharge it, and obviously the effects can't be too strong. But I think the idea of having the Spy have some kind of active thing he can be doing, something that isn't super risky, that he can, place down while he's hiding somewhere, but which forces the enemy team to be distracted and to scramble to deal with his little harassers, is something that would really make his kit come together. But again, the problem is that we don't know how this works when there's like 5 spies on the team. That could be super annoying, and that kind of puts a nail in the coffin of this idea and really ideas that are similar to it in general. So far, Team Fortress 2 does a decent job of balancing all of its weapons and classes for the kind of game that it is. But I still think overall it could do a better job. Now of course, again, that would require Valve to actually pour some gravel into the giant sinkhole that separates the hallway from the Team Fortress 2 computers, but I mean gravel's like what, like $7 a pound or something like that? Can't afford that shit. So until such a time when Valve is hiring idea guys who can't actually code in C++ worth a damn, Spy will have to remain as kind of a wishy-washy bad class. But then again, that's what Spy players like, isn't it? You can't really beat free gambling. So hey, maybe after all it's for the best that Spy is kinda shit. I mean, how else would you represent the French? But yeah, I'm friggin' done with this video, okay pal? Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time, when we will be talking not about Team Fortress 2's mechanics, but more so the writhing pile of screaming worms that is its community. So stay tuned, you sons of bitches.